Gentlemen, do you want to introduce yourselves very briefly, and then we can go into the quick Q&A afterwards?
Yeah, so I'm Chris Woodroof. I'm the Managing Director of Manchester Airport, and I'm also on the board of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway that Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham set up in order to advocate for this new railway, and delighted that we have now got beyond advocacy and we're getting into actually getting a spade out, or at least a pencil and a piece of paper to do some drawing of what it might look like.
And I'm Henry Harrison, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. And with our members, including MAG, we've been strong advocates on behalf of the business community for building that wider corridor across the Pennines that will unlock the productivity benefits that we, as a business community, know would be vital, not only to our business supporters, but to everyone who lives and works in the north of England.
And that's our agenda. So we've got a couple of questions that we're going to just generally pose, which will hopefully cover many of the areas that some of you are interested in. But as I say, if they're not and it doesn't cover it, feel free to grab that microphone and go for it yourselves. But the first question which I'll pose is, does the recent announcement, which was alluded to there, mean that Northern Powerhouse Rail is actually going to happen? And before I let you answer that question, for Henry, I wondered if you could start with tracing the announcement, but also give us a very brief plotted history of the project, because quite a few people will have come in at various stages. Within an hour.
I reckon Henry's got an hour on the plotted history.
I've got a book in me on it.
I'll give you very brief.
I'll give you very brief. Many of our members and supporters are here in the audience, and will be very familiar with the kind of realities of how challenging this has been, if I'm honest. So here in Manchester over a decade ago, the then Chancellor George Osborne, who was our kind of founding chair after he left government, committed to something at the time that was called HS3. Branding-wise, the kind of HS branding, not quite as au fait now as it was then. And essentially what he was arguing for was that you needed predominantly a new line across the Pennines, and in various forms that has survived as an ambition. I think what over the years, the challenge has been that various governments have been very committed to the idea of doing it, but not actually to doing any of it. So Boris Johnson went back to the same location in the Power Hall at the Museum of Science and Industry just down the road from here, and made a number of commitments, which turned out not to really equate to very much in reality. And so what's quite exciting, as I'm sure Chris will get onto in the detail of the conversation, is that there is actually now work happening. So this isn't the promise of a new railway line across the Pennines, because we've had that for basically 10 years.
Yeah.
It's that the actual practical work of building one is starting to begin. And I think you can, that network now includes a number of interventions which will eventually give you a sort of nearly new, and in some cases entirely new, railway from Liverpool through to York. And that then allows you to continue on to Newcastle in the northeast and to Hull. And that unlocks a significant economic corridor. So the Northern Growth Corridor, as the government refers to it, as Lord Jim O'Neill, who also came up with the bricks, calls it Manchester Leeds Pool, the concept of a sort of virtual city that links those very close urban centres. Because anyone who landed in Manchester today from anywhere else in the world, from China, from the US, would observe the fact that our cities here in the north of England are relatively small in global terms. But if you add them together, just in that Pennine belt, you're at a population of around 8 million, which is more comparable to a decent-sized American or Chinese city.
Okay.
And the logic has always been that if you could make them function more as a single economic area, you would get significant agglomeration benefits. So you would create a travel-to-work area as well that's broadly comparable with another not dissimilar location in London and the southeast. And at the moment, that isn't the case in the north of England. You can't regularly commute even from, say, Bradford to here in Manchester. You can't easily get a flight by public transport, which I'm sure, again, Chris will get into in a bit more detail. And that means that the economic opportunities here in Manchester are not equally felt across the Pennines and vice versa. And so something that's good news for Manchester doesn't necessarily bring benefits to other places in the north of England.
Okay, with you.
And that leads to suboptimal outcomes because people don't necessarily take the best job available to them because they can't move and reliably expect another job to come along. And that the realities of what London provides, which is a very dynamic economy that can make the best use of the people who live there, is just not how the North's economy currently works.
Okay.
And Northern Powerhouse Rail is not the answer. It's not a solution looking for a problem. It was always a way to deliver on an economic ambition.
Okay.
And the railway is simply an enabler for what the M62 cannot do. So you can't get enough people across the Pennines every day using a motorway that goes through some very high bits of the winter in the north. And it's incredible.
If I could interject there for a second, the lack of that, if I could hand on to this, the lack of that means what to the airport?
So I think before I answer that question,
Yeah.
In a way we've kind of titled this section incorrectly because we've talked about Northern Powerhouse Rail and Manchester Airport, whereas really what we're talking about is this Northern growth story.
Of which the airport is part.
Of which the airport is a very significant part. So, and having set that context, then you can answer the question, well, what does it mean for Manchester Airport? Well, today I measure my catchment in how long it takes to drive for an hour for short haul traffic, and how long it takes to how far away you can get in 2 hours driving for a long haul catchment. If you compare that with trains, it is broadly twice as long for the same distance away. And if you instead opened up trains to really connect Manchester Airport to places like Leeds and York and Liverpool, we double the number of people who can get to the airport in 90 minutes by train. 9-point-something million to 18 million people just by delivering this Northern Powerhouse Rail, double the number of people who can be here in 90 minutes at the airport, and as a result, generate an opportunity for the airport to grow beyond its current ambition, right? And its current ambition says we're at 32 million passengers today, we'd like to grow to 50 million passengers in the next 25 years. If you really got on with Northern Powerhouse Rail, then I could be going to our board and I could be saying, can you invest another billion or £2 billion in a new terminal infrastructure, because I need to enable our airport to grow to 60 million passengers, not 50, and that will add £10 billion of GVA into the north. Yeah. And that Northern Growth Corridor that we've now both referenced, that says that connecting up the north properly is worth an extra £90 billion of GVA, economic benefit. And people say, well, that's an awfully large number, Chris. How on earth do you get there? Well, I'm saying this little parcel of land south of Manchester called Manchester Airport, it's good for 10 billion on its own. The rest of the north just has to do the other 80.
The other 80.
And so it's eminently doable. And as we said, what's exciting is that rather than advocating, we're now in a place where there's money in this 3-year spending review to actually design it. The routes that are already earmarked are protected, and the new routes are starting to be looked at being protected, so as we can actually get on with somebody with a spade digging a hole and actually building a railway.
And on that, and linking to a previous presentation we had from Mr. Law talking about TfL, they've got their 2.2 billion commitment for the next 4 years done. I know you're saying that work has started. What level of commitment is there with the recent announcements to make you fully committed to moving forward?
So there's £1 billion in this spending review, which is doing a mixture of the short-term pieces, which Henry's much better placed to talk to than I am, but also some money to actually get on with the design of the Liverpool to Manchester railway section, which is what follows closely behind the near-term stuff. And it's also worth remembering that we have work going on today. You know, the Transpennine upgrade work is happening right now and is a railway project that's on time and on budget and will create an enormous benefit. But the challenge is all those trains arrive at Manchester Victoria and then grind to a halt because we haven't done this piece of work.
And I've looked at the imagery and everybody can see that online and their various lines. I think they're even the different colours if you can be bothered to look. Does it all start at the same time, or is it one followed by the other?
It's a phase, as Chris alludes to, it's a phased approach. So over the other side of the Pennines, there's a number of upgrade schemes an upgrade and electrification between Leeds and Sheffield, between Bradford and Leeds, a new station in Bradford, and colleagues from Bradford, I think, around if people want to ask about what that some of that might mean in terms of opportunities in the near term. And what that unlocks is that because of transparent route upgrades, there are some significant opportunities to make more of the existing connectivity we've got from Yorkshire to Manchester. And those improvements will make more of that. And there's also some things you can do between York and Leeds that make the most of those links.
And sorry, the ones you're referring to, are they part of the billion or they were happening anyway?
That will, some of that billion will be designing those upgrade schemes. But the money to actually start doing that will come at the next spending review. And this government, very helpfully, regardless of who makes up the next government, whoever that may be, has another spending review before it finishes. So the kind of proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So phase one of NPR starts at the end of this parliament in earnest. So we're now in the planning, the last of the planning phase. And obviously we've also got, as Chris alludes to, the end of Trans-Pennine route upgrades. So the opportunity for the north of England is, and we've seen this in kind of electrification schemes elsewhere, that you do those schemes and they stop. And you don't get any of the synergies, the benefits. And we've seen from Scotland that if you have a rolling programme of electrification, the cost does come down and the reliability and the speed of doing it is much better. So the theory is that that existing delivery model for Trans-Pennine route upgrades could just carry on. So it isn't having to stand up a new organisation, a new government arm's length body. Again, not a process that's been without problems when we've done that for other big projects. So, and the kind of risk mitigation is that we now, as Chris alludes to, know that we can electrify a certain bit of line for a certain price, and we can consistently do that if we keep on the machine churning when it finishes doing the existing line between York and Manchester.
And one of the bits of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway that we already know exactly where that's going to go is from Manchester Airport into the city of Manchester. And we know it's an underground route at least until it gets to Piccadilly, and there's a debate about what happens actually at Piccadilly, but we're all very clear from Manchester Airport and Manchester City that we'd really like it to be an underground station because it can then carry on through east towards Leeds and York. But that route, if we are to the same point Henry makes about electrification, the second one of those tunnelling machines comes out of the ground in HS2 and thinks it's going to enter retirement. It's like, no, drop it on a low loader, drive it to Manchester and stick it back in the ground at the airport and have it sent off towards the city of Manchester.
Understood. You mentioned there about, I think one of you mentioned collaboration. The airlines, have they committed to supporting more investment if this plan comes to fruition, or is it wait until it happens and then we'll decide?
This is more of an airport than an airline piece, to be honest. And because what I'm trying to make Manchester Airport is an incredibly attractive place to come and do business as an airline. We talk about wanting to be our number one choice for passengers and number one choice for airlines. And we've had a very successful 25. We won routes with new airlines, Indigo, flying direct to Mumbai and Delhi. And we know that just that one extra route or those two extra routes will add tens of millions of pounds of GVA to Manchester. But as you make that Northern Powerhouse Rail connectivity generate a much broader catchment, then when we're out selling to airlines, we have an even better story than one we have today.
So is that a kind of build it and they will come type approach, or?
I think if you draw a line and you started in 1950 and you looked at aviation passenger growth, it is a straight line other than where something has happened, like COVID or the Gulf War. But the rest of the time, it's just a straight line of growth. And so the question for Manchester is, where does it want to stop growing? Does it want to stop growing at 50 million passengers in 25 years' time, or does it want to carry on to 60 million and get there quicker?
And if I extend that, because I was thinking more passenger, but obviously it's not limited to passenger as well, it's freight and everything else. What effect would that have on the region? Well, the airport to begin with and the region afterwards, if you don't mind.
Well, so again, we talk about an extra £10 billion of GVA as a result of the airport, but it's very difficult to imagine what that looks like. What does £1 billion of GVA look like if it was sat on the desk, right? So you can convert it, and you can say that today Manchester Airport generates all in about 80,000 jobs. And that extra £10 billion is another 100,000 jobs.
Okay.
So
Very
that's
tangible.
what it looks like. Just the airport's piece of this growth story is an extra 100,000 people with jobs.
And from, I guess the onus goes then on you to deliver. Are all of the stakeholders, namely the big cities that are on that map, are they all bought in?
Yeah, no, and what's exciting is that this is the government have committed sort of notionally a kind of £45 billion envelope.
Yeah.
But the principle of it is that, for example, as Chris alluded to around an underground station at Piccadilly, some of the aspirations, for example, in Liverpool, it will also be the case that local areas will make some sort of contribution.
Yeah.
There's lots of housing developers over in Cheshire, just outside Greater Manchester's boundaries, who are very keen to build lots of housing. Those people should legitimately make a contribution towards the costs of this infrastructure. So what you've got is an envelope, but it's not limited or constrained simply by what central government is prepared to pay. And I think the lessons from Crossrail and the Elizabeth line, as it's now known, is that when the Treasury wanted to cancel it, one of the reasons was that George Osborne, as Chancellor at the time, didn't want to. So you do need political commitment and consistent political support. But Canary Wharf Group, where the now Deputy Mayor in London for business was at the time working, Howard Dorber, had started building the station, right, in short order, and were very clear they were going to need to be compensated if the railway line never arrived. And so in a country where, bluntly, we do seem to change infrastructure policy quite a lot, having some investors who are not just central government would be very healthy, and I think that's one of the lessons from HS2. If you compare the Japanese high-speed lines that have been built for the last 4 or 5 decades, all of them have investment from local and regional government and national government. None of them are purely national projects, and why that's possible is that Japanese municipalities and regional government have significant more tax powers than here in Manchester. So this is the city region in the country of England, excluding Scotland and Wales, that's the most tax freedom. But compared to a region of Germany, compared to even France, which is historically one of the most centralised countries in the world, as we are, you have more tax powers than we have here in Manchester.
Right.
So if we are going to raise those local contributions, then the obvious point is that Treasury and the UK government collectively are going to have to give more of the taxation powers, because at the moment, if you build a new station at Piccadilly, particularly an underground station, there's huge economic benefits to the country, and they all go back to central government through the tax system, pretty much. Whereas if you want Greater Manchester and the mayor here to invest some money in it, more of the revenue is going to have to return to Greater Manchester. So I think that lesson about, and London's a good example of that, because the Elizabeth line was partly funded by Greater London, and it's been hugely successful. And yes, the fare income goes back to London, but actually most of the tax benefit does still go back to central government. So although London paid for Crossrail, UK government still gets most of the tax uplift, and so it's maybe strange for a sort of northerner to be shilling for TfL and the Mayor of London, but that doesn't feel very fair to me. So it's not just a northern argument, it's a wider point that if you want to build transport in this country, you need the people being asked to invest in those schemes to be able to borrow against the future revenues. And fare box is one type of revenue you could borrow against, but there are other more significant, and the most obvious one being payroll tax. Every penny of every bit of income and national insurance paid in Greater Manchester goes back to central government. Payroll taxation is probably the most obvious form of uplift, because you employ more people in Manchester, because you create more jobs in Manchester. So largely that tax goes back to central government. Okay. If Chris employs more people at the airport, if his supply chain and partners employ more people at the airport, that raises money for the Treasury. Doesn't actually pay any money to the economy here in Greater Manchester.
Can I interrupt there for a second, because we had the mayors on earlier and they were talking about more devolution power that they had to spend money on their areas. It's their pot of money. Admittedly, we know where it's coming from, but it's their pot nonetheless. So are you saying that those guys are going to take a slice of their pie to help the overall pie grow? But because it sounds quite a big leap of faith to change the whole taxing system for the UK on the back of NPR.
And I think all of what Henry says is absolutely true, but I think to your point that there is, what are we going to get done in 2 years, 5 years, a decade? Yeah. But I think one of the big differences between Northern Power Rail and HS2 is the fact that along the route of HS2 were a lot of people who didn't want HS2 to go through their part of the... Whereas all the mayors, right from west to east, are bought into us needing this and it being the right thing to do across the country. And they are of varying different political persuasions. And that is how, with that kind of political momentum, whether you're in Warrington, in Trafford, in Manchester City, in Liverpool City region, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and you head east into Yorkshire, everyone along the route is saying, yes, we want this, we want it yesterday, we want to put our shoulder behind getting it done, and our political enthusiasm to get it done.
I'm a layman, and most people here are not. But one of the arguments was you need a route from London up north, that's going to open up the north. And now we're talking, in this argument, more about a horizontal approach. And I think the guys earlier were talking about the Oxford and Cambridge routes, everything being horizontal. Do you need the vertical bit as well? Or is this almost self-satisfying?
It was always a bit of a fake debate to trade off east-west connectivity for north-south, right? Because the obvious point is you need both.
Yep.
And without getting into lots of map-related issues, the bit of line that Chris talked about earlier, from Manchester Piccadilly to the airport, is also part of HS2 originally. Do you mean that? If you ever want to run a train from here in Manchester to Birmingham or London using the HS2 network, you need that tunnel anyway. It's not just a stupid political argument, because what the last government sort of said to Manchester, and they said it in this room, right, just literally next door, here in Manchester Central, the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak came to Manchester to cancel HS2, which was, even for that government, a particularly strange scheduling decision, if I'm honest. But they came to Manchester to cancel HS2, and what they said was, you can have east-west, because we're going to save the money from north-south.
Okay.
And the reality was that was just completely fictitious, right? Because this scheme is still a few years away. HS2 between, say, Crewe and Handsacre was ready to go. So what you're doing is sort of, it's the kind of bird in the bush metaphor, right? Yeah. You're trading a scheme that is immature for one that is in the future, and in the future for one that could happen right now. And that's never a good trade-off, because you would have still built MPR when it was always going to be built. It will take as long as it takes. Now the money's been committed to do the design work, to get a mature design, for example, for the section between Manchester and Liverpool, which is referred to as Stage 2. Cancelling HS2, in fact, because it created 2 years of hiatus, has made that take longer, not made it easier or quicker, or make it happen sooner. And so the argument that's been made by the critics of HS2 that by cancelling it they could spend more on northern connectivity, the people who said that at the time, one of the advocates for that position was Andrew Gilligan, who advised both Boris and advised Rishi Sunak. Well, Andrew's now against Northern Powerhouse Rail as well. So there is a kind of there's a funny element to this. It's not really funny, but it's slightly funny, which is that the people who advocated that sort of east-west should come first, it's more economically important. There's an element of truth to that, but because you started north-south first, there is no benefit to east-west of delaying north-south. Yeah, and in fact, when someone actually stood in this building and did that, it had exactly the opposite result. Effect. So we have tried that. We've tried delaying north-south to accelerate east-west. It didn't work. And this government has restored the principle that they will build some sort of railway between Manchester and Birmingham. And it's a lot easier to do that because you're already committed to doing Liverpool-Manchester, which is the hardest bit of that route, to be honest.
And if you look at the airport station, you will build that once, ready for a future north-south connection as well as the west-east. Because west-east is not a high-speed line. It is a line that means you can get from Manchester Airport to Liverpool in 20 minutes and into the centre of Manchester in 10, and that will revolutionise travel to the airport in that locale. But when you make the connection on to the east, that's when the real benefits come, and that's when most of these extra 9 million passengers that can get to the airport in 90 minutes get found from.
And we should pause for a second. Are there any questions from the floor? I'm sure there will be. Or have they covered everything? A perfect presentation.
We can carry on ranting.
I'm not sure we've been ranting.
Nothing?
Maybe by my very high bar, we've not been ranting.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end, but I just wanted to make sure there weren't any kind of burning issues there. We're coming towards the end of our time. Is there anything you want to leave with these guys that you haven't said already? Any kind of you need to make sure, or whatever you do, don't, or expect the following? Anything you'd like to leave them with?
I think from my perspective, it's today, Manchester Airport has less than 20% of its passengers get to the airport by public transport. And if any London airport was sat on stage, they'd be talking about 50%. In fact, Gatwick are targeting 60% of their passengers by 2030. It's 20% at Manchester Airport, and there is one reason for that and one reason only, which is all around infrastructure. So we have to sort infrastructure out, but this is not writing blank checks just in order to have more passengers come on a sustainable transport option. This is actually about growing the North by an extra £90 billion.
And before I go into your last words, Henry, just to qualify that, so at the moment, if I go all the way across the line, what are those customers, passengers, freight deliverers using
They're
today?
all having to take roads.
Oh, wow, okay.
It takes longer to get to Sheffield from Manchester Airport by train today than it did in the 1970s. You know, that's 50 years ago.
Okay.
It's frightening.
Take that point away. And Henry, your last word?
So I think my point would be that this is now happening. It's not a theoretical thing anymore, and I think that's really exciting because, in the end, what we know from the research is that whatever the trails and tribulations of HS2, it has driven investment in Birmingham already. There are people applying for planning permission, building buildings in Birmingham that would never have been built. In fact, I'm sure we'll see it in Deloitte's crane survey going forward. That significant uptick in construction activity. The same is true at Old Oak Common. And the opportunity here in the north of England is to leverage private investment. So this is not just about the public sector doing a transport project for transport benefits. This was always designed to encourage private sector investment, to encourage the private sector to create jobs. And I think there is an element of that if you want the country to be a fairer and more equal one, then there is no way to do that without investing some public money. You can't just believe that the country will be more prosperous. We tried that with Levelling Up, sort of just all kind of hummed, sort of shut our eyes for a little while, held our fingers in the air, sort of hoped we could just make people feel better about their lives, which was essentially the government's policy. It doesn't actually work. Do you mean like you have to actually get people in better paid jobs for them to feel like they have a better standard of living? Because that's the reality of what they expect. A few hanging baskets, some park benches don't cut it. And this is about the reality of the fact that there is about £8,000 a year difference between the average northerner and someone in London South East every year. But that also means we pay less tax, right? So my point is that it's, however much that tax we retain, which I've obviously said we should keep more of it, we're still going to give most of it back to central government. Yeah. And the reason why this country is broke is because we have a productivity problem. But London's productivity, although it's been stagnant in the last few years, is broadly comparable to other cities like it around the world. The issue is that the kind of Greater Manchester productivity surge, which sees this as the kind of city region growth in terms of kind of capital of that growth happening, is starting from a very low base. And if we want the whole country to be able to afford the decent public services people expect, we've got to get people in the north paying more tax.
Got you.
And at the moment, they don't earn enough money to pay enough tax.
Okay.
If we can solve that problem, we'll solve not just the north's problems, but a lot of the country's financial problems long term as well.
Well, I hope you took all the positives from that and not the fact that you have to pay more tax. That wasn't what we wanted to leave you with. But I don't think that was a rant. I think that was a really well-constructed discussion. So that's the first thing to say. But a massive round of applause for Chris and Henry. Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen.